Shavua Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Orlah. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Yud Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvedlana, Aranbayev, and Liyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. The following Mishnah will deal with the laws of Tumah, not nullification. The reason it's included here, the Mefarshim explain, is because of its similarity to Mishnah 11, where Rabbi Eliezer and the sages disagreed about whether to follow the last substance that fell in. The Mishnah discusses the case of a leather utensil, such as a shoe, that was rubbed with oil to soften it. Much of this oil becomes absorbed into the leather, and some of it comes out again when the utensil is used and pressure is applied to it. So, for example, when a person wears the shoe and steps down on it. So in the case the Mishnah discusses, the shoe was rubbed twice, once with oil that was tameh and once with oil that was tahor. The question is, which oil came out when the person wore the shoe? The Mishnah begins by giving two cases, one where the tameh oil was used first and one where it was used last. The Mishnah says, Kelim shesachan b'shemen tameh. If leather utensils are rubbed with tameh oil to soften them, thereby making them tameh, the Mefarshim explain that leather utensils such as shoes are often stiff, so it was common to rub olive oil into them to soften the leather. So in this case, the oil he used was tameh, and we know by rabbinic law, a tameh liquid can make a utensil tameh, as the Rambam tells us in Rechot Avot Tumah, chapter 7, Halacha 1, and therefore the tameh oil he rubbed onto the shoe made it tameh. V'chazar v'sachan b'shemen tahor, and then after being immersed in a mikvah to make them tahor, they were rubbed again with oil, this time with tahor oil. And the Mefarshim explain the leather utensil now has two different oils absorbed into it: the tameh oil, which was absorbed before it was immersed in the mikvah, and the tahor oil, which was absorbed after it was immersed in the mikvah. Now, the tameh oil that was absorbed in the shoe did not become tahor when it was immersed in the mikvah, because foods and beverages, with the exception of water, do not become tahor in a mikvah. Only people and utensils become purified this way. Nevertheless, the tameh oil in the shoe does not make it tameh while it's absorbed in it, because a source of tumah that is absorbed inside something else cannot transmit tumah, as the Gemara tells in Masechet Chulin, page 71a. So again, it says, if leather utensils were rubbed with tameh oil, and then after being immersed in a mikvah to make them tahor, they were rubbed again with oil, this time with tahor oil, or shesachan b'shemen tahor, or the opposite. First they were rubbed with tahor oil, v'chazar v'sachan b'shemen tameh, and then after the tahor oil had dried, they were rubbed again with tameh oil, thereby making them tameh, and then they were immersed in a mikvah to make them tahor, and then they were used and some of the oil came out. The question is, do we assume that this was the tameh oil that came out, or do we assume that it was the tahor oil that came out? Again, the Mefarshim explain, if we assume that the tameh oil came out, the utensil, the shoe, will again become tameh from it. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Eliezer says, Achar Rishon and Iba, I followed the first oil, meaning the oil that was absorbed first is the one that comes out. And the Mefarshim explain, the Yerushalmi, according to the version of the Gra, that the second oil pushes out the first, meaning when the second oil is absorbed, it penetrates more deeply and pushes the first oil closer to the surface. Therefore, when the leather is squeezed and some oil comes out, it's the first oil that comes out. And therefore, in the case where the tameh oil was absorbed first, the utensils would be tameh. In the case where the tahor oil was absorbed first, the utensils would remain tahor. But the sages say, achar acharon, we followed the last oil, because according to the sages, the oil that was absorbed first caused the leather to become largely saturated and unable to hold more oil, much more oil. So therefore, the second oil remains close to the surface and is the one that gets pushed out. So therefore, if the second oil was tameh, the utensil would be tameh. If the second oil was tahor, the utensil would be tahor. And that is an abotai of Mishnah Yud Gimel. Mishnah Yud Daled now returns to the subject of two sourdoughs that combine to leaven permitted dough. In Mishnahs 11 and 12, we discuss this in a case where one of the sourdough was prohibited. Our Mishnah gives the law in a case where both sourdoughs were prohibited. If sourdough of tiruma and sourdough of kilei kerem fell into permitted dough, lo bazeh kedei lechametz velo bazeh kedei lechametz, and there was not enough of either this one or that one to leaven the dough on its own, so neither the tiruma or kilei kerem sourdough could work on its own, v'nistarfu v'chimtzu, but they combined and leavened the dough together. Asur lezarim, the dough is prohibited to non-Kohanim because both the Tirumah sourdough and the Kilei Kerem sourdough are prohibited to them. Now, since both sourdoughs are of the same kind, they combine to prohibit the dough, even though they're each prohibited by different Isur, following the view of the Tanna Kama we said in Mishnah 10. Umutar leKohanim, but it is permitted to Kohanim, because for them Tirumah at least is permitted, since Mefarshim explain, since only the Kilei Kerem is forbidden to them and it cannot leaven the dough by itself, the dough is permitted to them, and the Mefarshim explain a Kohen may eat this dough because Tirumah is permitted to him. The only ingredient that's prohibited to him is the Kilei Kerem, and it is not able to leaven the dough by itself, therefore it becomes nullified, following the view of the sages in Mishnah 11, that when two sourdoughs are needed to leaven dough and only one of them is prohibited, we say Zeh v'zeh goem mutar. When this one and this one cause it, it is permitted. Now the Mefarshim point out that the Mishnah is discussing a case where there is enough dough to nullify the Tirumah by a margin of 100 to 1 and the Kilei Kerem by 200 to 1. The only reason why they should not become nullified is because is that leaven does not become nullified, like we learned in Mishnah 6. So since in this case the Kilei Kerem could not leaven the dough by itself, it becomes nullified and is permitted to non-Kohanim. Rabbi Shimon matir lezarim v'lakohanim. The Mishnah concludes, but Rabbi Shimon permits it to both non-Kohanim and Kohanim, because since the two pieces of leaven are not forbidden under the same prohibition, they do not combine to prohibit it. Again, Rabbi Shimon is consistent with his ruling in Mishnah 10 that even two substances that are the same do not combine to prohibit if they are forbidden by different prohibitions. And again, we're discussing a case where there's enough dough to nullify the Tirumah by 100 to 1 and the Kilei Kerem by 200 to 1. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody Shavi Shavuot Tov. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.